Would you please introduce our August next speaker?
Certainly. Paul Bogaard retired from teaching after 40 years at Mount Allison University, having published on the philosophy of chemistry, history of science in Canada, ancient philosophy, and since retirement, the local history of the Chignecto area of maritime Canada. He edited the first volume of Whitehead's Harvard Lectures in 2017, and he will be talking to us today about from a philosophy of evolution to a philosophy of organism.
Is that shared?
Yep.
Yes,
Good.
you're good to go.
So I am simply going to read my text. If my voice lasts, this was the paper I sent in, now somewhat edited and cut down. In February of 1927, at the beginning of the last term in the 2 years of lectures covered in HL2, Conger captured Whitehead saying, "Organisms arise out of an environment in which they maintain their existence, but by their very existence, they impose a character on the environment. So environment and organism evolved together." This interdependence of organism and its environment as the heart of evolution had already sprung forth in Whitehead's lectures from 24-25. It was the topic of my own contribution to Whitehead Revealed back in 2017, which is now published, and proposed by Whitehead himself as, in his words, philosophy of evolution. There had been no hint at this turn to presuppositions from the life sciences in his earlier publications. By February of 27, he had already been invited to deliver the Gifford Lectures the following year, and in his acceptance proposal as title for these lectures, The Concept of Organism. We know in hindsight that he changed that title to Process and Reality, although he famously declared in the preface to that book that he still had in mind a philosophy of organism. Therein lies my challenge. As I'm proposing in my title for this presentation, do we have evidence in the 1925-27 lectures of Whitehead shifting in some meaningful sense from a philosophy of evolution to a philosophy of organism? It is clear from the outset that Whitehead was declaring in the lecture witnessed by Conger, which was from the very last term of lectures covered in HL2, that evolution by organisms arising out of their environment and imposing a character on that environment in the process is still actively featured in the presuppositions he was trying to articulate. So any transition I expect to find within these 2 years is not going to be as simple as Whitehead setting evolution aside in favor of organisms. Those concepts are simply too inextricably intertwined. But there is still room here for some shift in emphasis, a shifting of focus. That's what I'm after. So let me begin by reviewing what was revealed in the very first year of lectures Whitehead gave at Harvard. In my contribution to that earlier conference focused on the lectures in HL1, I was quite prepared to acknowledge that it came as a surprise that Whitehead had not only declared the need to turn to biology for much needed insights, but that he would style his reconsideration of these presuppositions as philosophy of evolution. I argued then that it was particularly revealing. The inspiration of these declarations came not just from Bergson, Lloyd Morgan, and others Whitehead had known in the emerging world of theoretical biology, but from his relatively recent acceptance of Lawrence acquaintance with Lawrence J. Henderson. When Whitehead said in December of his first year, in his words, the point of evolutionary philosophy is that order of nature must be looked on as itself an emergent mode, having a processional and transitional character. We're seeing there his confidence in setting the frame for his presuppositions as evolutionary from his friend Bergson, and that this could provide for emergence from his reading of Lloyd Morgan. However, that an understanding this might be achieved through an interaction of each organism with its environment, both adapting to it and adapting it in the process, that had been inspired by Henderson's books, Fitness of the Environment and Order of Nature. It was Henderson who had said, the organism and the environment each fits and is fitted by each other. Environments evolved along with their organisms, opening the way for Whitehead to explore how they must be, wholly interdependent. So drawing inspiration from the life sciences turns on how we conceptualize the organic. For Whitehead, you can see my quote marks here, the organism in itself is an environmental concept. And the process of evolution is driven by the challenge of procuring a favorable environment. The advantage of this point of view is that it admits of no jump whatever in principle between living and inanimate. Hence, even electrons might be considered themselves as organisms seeking a favorable environment. Whence stability. In his words, evolution towards stability is on the whole an evolution in which the modification of the environment is the important thing. The challenge Whitehead set for himself in reconsidering the presuppositions of science announced already in his inaugural lecture in September of 24 was, how are we to acknowledge both continuity and atomicity? Not to force a choice between them, but some way to reconcile them both. This broad framework was something he brought to Harvard, his Harvard years, from out of his earlier philosophical musings, so far as I can see, a conviction that seems that ran very deep and from which he did not depart through all his years of lecturing and publishing. As late as 1933, in Adventures of Ideas, he will say, these contrasted aspects of nature, continuity and atomicity, have a long history, reaching back to the origin of science. The conclusion is that neither can be dispensed with. Rephrased in the middle of that academic year, that is January 25, Whitehead suggested in his words, two ways of looking at nature which give you two rather extreme lines. Either your attention is caught by the enormous permanencies, and you make this the keynote of your thought, the mountains, the atoms, the electrons, where the trouble for this approach, this metaphysics, is time. Or you opt for change as your starting point, the ultimate entity in its own essence being transition, both internally and externally, so not independent of environment. All concrete things taken out of environment are abstractions. They're only concrete in environment. The order of nature is for us the unity of such transitional ultimates. So we have exactly the opposite difficulty. We're bothered by permanence. What seemed to me his response to this choice, Whitehead offered how to account for enormous stability of electrons, etc., by survival of the fittest. You go back to where within the order of nature you had fitful stretches of emergent, enduring entities. We finally got an order of nature dominated by these entities, which created an environment favorable not only to themselves, but to production of other entities of the same kind. An environment, in other words, created by a society of entities producing an environment favorable to the existence of them all. Environment has evolved as an environment which secures selection of definite types. So the key to the evolutionary problem was that of permanence. In Whitehead's arresting phrase, it's the endurance itself which is evolved. I must note in passing that the notion of society of entities makes its appearance here for what I believe is the first time. It does not get much play in his first year of the lectures at Harvard, and somewhat to my surprise, it gets little, if any, use in the 2 years covered by HL2. Once again, I'm going to reach beyond process and reality, where the concept of society of entities and society of societies came to play such an important, if supporting role, to the adventure of ideas, where Whitehead was still maintaining the real actual things that endure are all societies. They're not actual occasions. It's the mistake that has thwarted European metaphysics from the time of the Greeks, to confuse societies with the completely real things which are the actual occasions. Thus, a society enjoys a history expressing its changing reaction to changing circumstances. But an actual occasion has no history. It never changes. It only becomes and perishes. So somehow, through the becoming of each occasion, we arrive at societies, the only things which endure. By the end of Whitehead's first year of lectures, it seemed to me it was his unpacking the possibilities of organisms as enduring within a changing environment across an evolutionary timescale that gave him confidence there was a path forward. One could begin by embracing change, evolutionary process, and see a way towards understanding how stability and permanence might have been secured. The plasticity of the environment is the key to the evolutionary problem, namely that of permanence. Turning now to the 2 years of lecture notes covered in HL2, it quickly becomes evident that Whitehead does not continue his discussion with Henderson and his provocative suggestions about the evolving fitness of the environment. Henderson is no longer assigned as a reading. Thanks to the index, we know this. There seems to be little throughout these 2 years that suggests new twists in the concepts of environment and evolution not already declared or promised within HL1. I began this paper with Conger's notes, confirming that the concept of evolution and the role of the environment were still alive and well. So these insights from 2 years earlier are still at work, but somehow they seem now to have drifted to the background. They're no longer foregrounded. There are, however, definite indications as to where Whitehead is shifting his attention. In that same set of notes from Conger, we find, quote, "Is the environment merely one, if it's merely one of cross currents and chops, we're never going to get something of significance. But when there is the antecedent historic route in a favorable environment, which is such that each entity so peculiarly plays into one another's hands by congruity, that main description of any one entity is a summary of its antecedents and peculiarly aware of them, which is an enduring entity. Broadly speaking, the job of evolution is to get enduring entities going. And Whitehead seems to see his task as articulating the presuppositions that enable that get going of enduring entities. From out of the maelstrom of evolution, order can arise over time. in each case of an entity that endures. Strikes me this is what he is determined to work out. As Whitehead struggled to find ways to put his broader insight into his own words, we begin to find him expressing his thoughts in ways we'll certainly find more familiar in Process and Reality, but already from the beginning of 26. Quote, considering enduring organism the only entities worthwhile talking about, life history of organism is a succession of epochal occasions. Each occasion is a creative achievement, where epochal occasion is a definite creature. We noted earlier, as Whitehead later recalls in Adventure of Ideas, from what he had already worked out in Process and Reality, that an actual occasion has no history in this sense. Each only becomes and perishes.
Paul, you've got about 3 minutes.
Okay. Enduring organisms have a history, namely a succession of epochal occasions. It would be seen then that the job of evolution to get enduring entities going, the means by which an organic view can unfold, requires an organic view of affairs as an epochal view of time. Throughout the lectures from 25 to 27, Whitehead returns to this point repeatedly. It is becomingness that is epochal, which, as he was thinking this through already in the fall of 25, will require that each concrete occasion has time depth. Since creature requires time depth, then becomingness must have time depth, and time is epochal. In the previous year, Whitehead had concluded that by first seizing becomingness, the continuity of change, he could, through the broad strokes of evolutionary change, the interaction of organism and environment, envision the adaptation of environments favorable to survival and stability, the evolution, as he said, of endurance. Within a tighter focus, he is now suggesting that for enduring objects to arise, they must be comprised of occasions that are themselves epochal, each with a different time depth, that from a succession of them, endurance can be found. So by the end of his second academic year of lectures, Whitehead was proposing what was, I would argue, only hinted at as yet by the end of his first year. Organism and function seem more fundamental than any entity than mere process. This, however, is only possible with an epochal theory of becoming. The present epoch is an epoch, but in the past, what becomes has extensive continuity, but receiving it as an immediate present, there is atomic becoming. Thus, the balance between atomism and continuity haunts all scientific thought. So once again, Whitehead returns to this recurrent theme. One's metaphysical stance need not be forced to choose one over the other, but the challenge as ever is to find a way of acknowledging both. This same background assumption frames Whitehead's metaphysical inquiries from his inaugural lectures in 24 through to the 30s. He has determined, certainly by the spring of 27, to distinguish between the enduring objects which stretch out through our past at its most abstracted and extensive continuity, and the epochal becoming of the leading edge of the present, which should enable these two to coexist among our needed presuppositions.
Hey, Paul, I'm just looking at your page numbers there and the time we've got. You feeling like maybe you got a minute left?
Yeah, I'll finish this paragraph and maybe one more.
Okay.
Whitehead was not choosing between evolution driven by the influences of the environment over broad stretches of time and the survival of enduring entities within the succession of actual occasions. But just as the continuum will persist readily enough through our past, if we can just manage to clarify how the becoming of each passing present must be epochal, so the cosmic epochs will readily enough evolve through from era to era. What needed yet to be worked out was the comings and goings of enduring organisms. In that sense, Whitehead had come to appreciate, it seems to me, that it is all going to rest on meeting this more tightly focused challenge to fully articulate the concept of organism. So bring on the Gifford lectures. As you can see, I'm happily skipping some pages.
I see
had
that.
an analogy there, I'll skip. I just have this one last paragraph, which is a broader comment I'd like to offer. Are we, by focusing on what can be found in his lectures, instead of keeping to his published works, making much more of this shifting in terminology or shifting in focus than should be attributed to Whitehead? In what he decided to publish, Whitehead neither denied nor avoided the concept of evolution quite, but it certainly was never given center stage. So if we skip over and set aside what he was thinking out loud to his students at Harvard in his lectures, we would not know that at one point he suggested that evolution was going to be the key. This goes right to the heart of the question about what we learn from, what is revealed by an examination of these lectures. Are they drafts of chapters later published? It does not seem so, at least not these lectures. They do reveal changes. So are we watching over his shoulder while Whitehead edits his written work? That does not seem to quite capture it either. We're following him as he pushes through the implications of what he's been thinking in what he has been saying. These are possibilities he seems to consider. There are possibilities he seems to consider, but then leaves behind. There are others he maintains and refines. And as some of these resolve themselves into what he finds plausible as a metaphysical framework of presuppositions, we find him shifting his attention to where more work needs to be done. So that finally is my reading of this case. The concept of evolution has a
Wait, Paul,
job.
Paul, we're not going to have time for discussion. I think I'm going to let
in
that
that case
paragraph.
also.
Thank you. Sorry to cut you off. I do want to get to, you've laid a great menu here, and let's turn to George if you're still interested in jumping in, and then to Joe.
Yes, Paul, there are many questions that your presentation raises, but the thing at the very end, how are we to view and what are we to learn from these lectures? It seems to me one could say that I'm not sure where the idea of thinking of them as drafts of chapters of books would come from. I remember struggling this when we first got all these materials together. We thought we had transcripts of courses that Whitehead taught a course in the philosophy of science, and he taught a seminar in logic, and that we would compile those in that way, only to discover that something else was going on, as Heath herself says in the beginning of year 2, as she retakes the course. It's a different course. Okay, well, what is that supposed to mean? And then, are these drafts of lectures? No. He's lecturing, but without heavily copious notes in the way Hegel would have had, Instead, he's lecturing like a mathematician. And just, a couple of notes on a back of an old envelope, and up at the chalkboard you go. So you're watching his thought evolve along the lines that eventuate in the published works. But before they're done, and with many false or blind alleys or whatever, does that seem still right to you, that we, in his classroom, we have a window into his mind at work and his thought and development?
I don't see any other way to frame what we find, precisely because we find topics coming up and then he lets them go.
Right.
We find other topics coming up. I mean, he mentioned societies of entities in December of 24. And we hear almost nothing about it until it becomes so important for process and reality. And then we have this strange case that I've been puzzling over for so long. You of all people understand how little of evolution we find in the published work. Here we find this idea not only kind of creeping in the sidelines, but erupting in the middle of lectures in the middle of 24, 25. And it's not as if he decides he was wrong about that, and so he lets it go. It's just, it kind of drifts off into context and background while he zeroes in on what he wants to work out now in the interior of this. And, you know, as somebody who's fascinated by the drift of ideas, the historical development we find through so many thinkers, it's not very often we get the chance to find somebody getting excited about an idea and then kind of letting it do its job and then easing back and turning to other things.
Joe, I have a feeling you want to talk about something similar as well.
Yeah, I mean, my kind of thought and question was fairly similar to what George just asked, because actually, and not to flog my forthcoming book too much, but I devote about 2 chapters to it in kind of this question of what is the relationship between the Harvard lectures and Whitehead's published works. And I agree that they really don't seem to be drafts of his books. I expected that they would be a little more of that than I think they end up being. But one of the things that struck me is that it might have been, or probably was, a useful thing that Whitehead was having to teach a new crop of students every semester and every year, and kind of rethink his baseline in order to present the basics to a new crop of students, and that was actually a useful thing for seeing the evolution of his philosophy, because we're seeing refinement as the years go on. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Fair enough.
That was too easy. I was expecting more. What, I can't remember a
Yes.
philosopher giving a one-word answer to a question ever. So Paul, that was
Just to prove that it can happen.
Oh, all right. We've got George. We got 2 minutes. Feel free. You want to add one more bit?
You're muted, George.
Oh, you're still muted.
Here we go. Okay, sorry. Ethical theory of time. Obviously, in this account, you've shown how important quantized occasions are for there to be a progression into a society of ultimately enduring objects. It's the atomic bits that are real, but it's their succession which defines endurance and permanence. That's the permanence continuity change. Question: remember Lewis Ford and the discovery of the ethical theory? Do you still hold to the view that you and I shared and others, but that others like Ronnie Desmond were not sure of, that there was a discovery or was not a discovery of the ethical theory suddenly out of nowhere in your volume?
How long do you give me, Brian?
You get one word again, I guess. Actually,
No.
Ronnie's here too. Can you give a short yes, no, and then with a coda that we could maybe take it up again a little bit?
Maybe a sentence and a half. I've very much appreciated going through Ronnie's piece that does some resurrecting of Lewis Ford that was published in that volume. So thanks for that, Ronnie. And indeed, thanks for all the other help you gave me with volume 1. I haven't had a chance to say that in public. There's no doubt that there is a change in Whitehead's thought of exactly the kind that everyone has been describing for some time. It seems to me the question is do we have evidence of this happening at one moment? Does the light bulb come on at some point? Which is what always seemed to me what Lewis was trying to find in March, April. And Ronnie reminds us there's still something of that there. My reaction to that is still, well, there sure is a change, but I don't think any of these changes come about quite that quickly. Ronnie, he talks about Society of Entities in December of 24. Think how long it takes before that really starts to unwind as with the significance it has later on. At some point, this notion that he's going to have to come to, what's that wonderful phrase, a becomingness of continuity, not a continuity of becomingness. I mean, clearly that's coming into his mind with ever sharper focus. I just think that takes a while to get there.
I don't know. So I will promise Philip and others that we give you your full time, but this is such an interesting point. Ronnie, at the risk of throwing us completely off, I just wanted to give you a quick space if you wanted to, or maybe we should just move on. Do you have a thought? Do you want to come in, Ronnie?
No, maybe I can refer to my lecture of tomorrow. I will briefly address the point in the lecture.
That's a great point. Thank you for that. Okay, I like that a lot. I think that topic, by the way, is ripe for a special issue in process studies on returning to Lewis Ford's thesis. And I know you've got your wonderful piece tomorrow. You've had your piece in the earlier volume, but it's just such a great conversation that's been part of Whitehead scholarship for a long time. So I look forward to continuing and supporting the discussion. Let's all thank Paul again for his wonderful work on volume 1 and his paper today. Thank you so much, Paul. We really appreciate you.